As I'm getting set up to load 40 Smith & Wesson next, a couple of thoughts come to mind I'm going to share with you. 40 Smith & Wesson used to be hugely popular. A lot of law enforcement agencies jumped on it with the Glock Model 22, and we used to sell a lot of Glock Model 22s. And then for whatever reason, law enforcement agencies kind of went away from it. They went to 9 or 45 or whatever. But the 40 at that time really tapered off. But there were a lot of 40 Smith & Wesson firearms that were sold during its quote heyday. Now it's still reasonably popular, and I know a lot of people have them because I used to sell a lot of 22s and a lot of other guns as well. But one of the things about the Glock is I was always told because of the rifling in the Glock, you can only shoot jacketed bullets through it. Well, I hand load, and I don't always shoot jacketed bullets. In fact, I usually don't. I'll cast my own bullets. I shoot a lot of plated bullets, or maybe powder coat or high-tech coat or something along that line, or even a moly-coated cast bullet. Well, I was told from the beginning that because of the rifling in the Glocks, that if you push bullets like that through them too fast, they're going to strip through the rifling and you're going to lead the grooves. So a lot of guys would buy a cut rifle barrel. Okay. So now I fast forward a few years and I meet a fella from Smyrna. Now this is not the same Smyrna that you would associate with Sardis and Laodicea in Philadelphia. This is a fella who's from Smyrna, Georgia. And I said, "Do you work for Glock, or did you work for Glock?" And he said, "Yes." Cool, I have some questions for you. So we started talking about, first of all, does everybody who works for Glock, obviously they're shooting Glocks, do they all shoot full metal jacket? Because some of these guys I know are going to be hand loading. No, you just keep the velocity down a little bit and then you won't strip through the rifling. But if you want to get yourself a cut rifle barrel, cool. The other thing associated in the Glock's going to be notorious for is because of the unsupported chamber, you get that Glock bulge. So at the firing, as the casing puffs up, it gets ejected, then you go to put it in your sizing die. The sizing die, a lot of times, most of your carbides will have a bit of a radius right there at the bottom of the die. So you've got the case in the shell holder. So you've got this much of it up to begin with, and then if the radius only comes down to, say, here, everything beneath it then is going to have necessarily a bulge to it. So Lee has a bulge buster to straighten the case back up. Redding's got one, or you could use, like Redding also has, a steel die, which is cut flat on the bottom. It's not carbide, it's steel, so you don't have that carbide ring under there where you have that additional radius, and that's another way of dealing with it. Of course, if you're going to use a steel die, you need to put a little bit of lube on your casings, which to me is not a big deal. If you got a whole bunch of brass, throw it in a grocery bag, grab your bottle of lube, a pump, or an aerosol, spray it, shake it all up, let the isopropyl alcohol flash off, and in 2 minutes you're ready to load. To me, it's not a big deal. But I have some new casings that I'm going to be using today because I'm doing some cleanup again. I've got some new brass. I've got some 180 grain hollow point bullets that I'm going to load. And I've also got some Ramshot Silhouette powder. Again, it's a partial that I've loaded out of, and the can's been sitting around for a while, and I want to finish up everything that's in here so I don't have 50 cans with, like 3-4 ounces of powder, and I need to start using all this stuff up. Got my ammo checker out, and because I've got brand new brass now, it should never be an issue with brand new brass, because before you fire a casing, it should be the smallest dimension it'll ever be. When you shoot it in the gun, it puffs up to the size of the chamber, and then when you size it, it's going to size it back down to roughly halfway between the original unfired dimension and its fire-formed dimension. But I'm going to tell you right now, if you got a case gauge or an ammo checker, even when you're using brand new brass, double check it. I have gotten burned because something that I got out of a brand new bag of brass that I opened was not in spec, and it would not go in later on, so I had well, I had to deal with it. But these drop right in. I don't check every single one, but I just make sure I didn't get a batch of brass that wasn't out of spec. So now, again, if you are brand new and you're not familiar or you're still trying to get this ingrained in your brain, the setup on these things, you got the shell holder and the ram, run it all the way up. This is the sizing die. Now you're going to run down the decapping pin until it's protruding roughly 1/4 of an inch or maybe a little more beneath the bottom of the die. You want that decapping rod protruding enough to make sure it's going to knock out the old primer. Now it's not an issue in this instance because I'm using brand new brass, but this is the Redding steel die set. So if I had some casings that were fired in a Glock and I've got that bulge to deal with, this is again going to get closer to the rim cut. So I don't have there will still be a little bit of that, but it's not going to be enough to prevent any feeding and lockup of the gun issues. So again, shell holder of the ram, run it all the way up. The decapping pin is protruding a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch beneath the bottom of the die. I screw down the die until it makes contact with the shell holder, and then I'm going to set my lock ring. That one's done. Now in the second step, now if I had fired casings, by the way, I'd size a couple casings right now and double check them just to make sure that everything's going to work. And if I've got a case gauge or an ammo checker, that's what I'm going to do with that. Now I'm going to be loading the 180 grain hollow points, and I've got 50 of them in my little bowl right there. So I'm going to take a piece of brass that I either on a fired casing sized, because next I'm going to flare the mouth. You always set up your dies to allow the die to see the same position that the dies will see with the casing and the bullet and the ammunition as you go through the loading process. So in step number 2, the way I do it is I seat the primer, I run it up, and then I flare the mouth. So I've already got the small pistol because 40 Smith & Wesson does take a small pistol primer. Now I would use the exact same die set if I was going to load 10 millimeter. I'm not loading 10 millimeter, but if I was, it's the same die set. You just don't screw down the die as far with the flaring die and the seating die and the crimp because the same thing, just a little bit taller casing. So what I'm going to do here is I've got the expander stem screwed down not quite to the bottom of the die, but I've still got maybe 1/4 inch of thread up here. Now, if you wanted to, you could put an O-ring between the lock ring of your stem and the body of the die to allow a tiny amount of float. That way, when you put a piece of brass up into it, it can allow it to sort of self-center. So you're improving your concentricity, but you need to keep an eye on it, a close eye on it there, so it's not walking up and down on you. But you run this up here, and then I'm going to screw down the body of the die first until I begin to feel the resistance. Now the resistance is the point at which the mouth of the casing is going to begin to open up. And how much I open it up is dependent upon the projectile I'm going to load being able to be put right there on the mouth of the casing. I take my fingers away and it's going to stay put. So now I'm getting the resistance. I know I'm going to be at the point at which it's going to start getting close. So now I'm going to go to my stem. This is the macro adjustment. The stem would be the micro adjustment. And I don't want to overwork my brass. So I sneak up on this and I go pretty slow. And again, I'm using the projectile I'm going to load as my gauge as to how much flare I'm going to put on this thing. So I'm screwing it down a little bit more. I run it back up, grab a bullet, I try it. Now it's just starting to stay put, and it's seating on top of the mouth there pretty straight up and down. If I flare this much more, it's going to allow the bullet to start tipping more and more at an angle, and I want it to sit pretty much straight up and down. Now it's doing pretty much what I want it to do right there, so I don't want to flare it anymore. I can do another one just to make sure that it's exactly what I think I've just got. So I'm double checking myself. Flare another mouth of the casing. Yeah, that's fine. I could even back that up just a tiny bit. I've got a little bit more than I really need. So I'm going to back that up just a tiny bit, and that's fine. Now I have my notes here. I'm going to be seating this to an overall length of 1.125. So now I'm going to take a casing that is not flared, and I'm going to put this into the shell holder, and I'm going to run this all the way up into the die, and I'm going to screw down. This is the seating die. I'm screwing this down until it stops. Now, this is not quite to the shell holder. It's about that far above the shell holder. There's a little ledge in there, so if I wanted to do a crimp on it, I could crimp. I personally don't like to seat and crimp in one operation. I want to do it in two separate steps. So I find the mouth of the casing, and then I back it up a little more than a quarter turn. You can go to a half a turn, just so it's not touching the mouth of the casing. Now I'm using a casing that has not been flared, because if the height is here on an unflared and you flare the mouth, what did you do? You just lowered it a tiny bit. So now I know once a casing is flared, I'm well below the mouth of the case. Now I can take a projectile that is with a flared casing, set this on top, and I'm going to run this up into here. Now I can feel that scraping the sides of the die as it goes in the flare. Now I've got here, I'm looking at 1.125 as my OAL. So I make sure my caliper is zeroed, and I start measuring. Now I'm at 1.162. I've got a ways to go. So again, I'm just going to kind of creep up on this. I'm going to use my stem because that's my micro adjustment. And I overshot. I overshot it already. I'm at 1.11. So I'm going to back this up. Now, I overran that, so I can get out my kinetic bullet puller. And I'm not going to necessarily pull the bullet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit it lightly on the floor so it pulls out a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and back this up a bit more than I need to. And again, I'll creep up on it, maybe turning it down in 1/4 of an inch or so turns. Then, once I got that squared away, I'm going to be loading with silhouette. Again, because I've just got a few ounces left in here and I want to use this up. I've got about 100 bullets that I'm going to load with 100 pieces of brass. I'm going to use my quick trickle from Hornady again, because that thing is just kind of cool. I don't know why I'm so enamored with it, but I do. I've got a lot of choices, but that's what I'm going to use. And I drop it into a balance scale. Of course, an electronic scale is certainly much faster, and you don't have to wait for the balance scale to go up and down like this. But I'm not in a hurry. I'm taking my sweet time. I am making absolutely spot on, perfect ammunition, and I'm never in a hurry when I'm making ammo. I'd rather go to the range and have 100 cartridges that are spot on, absolutely perfect, that function flawlessly, than 500 stuff that's problematic and I'm trying to, you know what I mean? I just don't want trouble at the range. That's what I'm doing. Happy trails.